What up, y'all? I'm Dr. CBS here with my girl, Dr. Layla Brown, and you're tuned in to season 2, episode 10 of The Last Dope Intellectual. All right, y'all. So we have a very interesting, very meandering shoot the shit today. But before we start, let us shout out our brand new patrons, Denzel C, and Mark Joseph. So thank y'all so much for your support. Thank you for continuing to allow us to pay our producer. So let's launch in. Here's what I wanted to think about this week, y'all. Why is it important to have friends and comrades off of the internet, and particularly off of social media? I've just been seeing some falling outs between these sort of cliques or I won't say cabal, these groupings on Twitter and on Instagram. And it just seems like these are political or personal friendships that have formed solely online and didn't necessarily have too much connection, maybe some texting offline. And then they blew up because these folks came together through shared, I don't know, theoretical interest or maybe loose political connection, but it's happening in cyberspace. And so it seems like, when we're on social media, we can't present our full selves, or we don't. I mean, you could, and some people are more transparent than others, but you're presenting a version of yourself, not least because you're doing it, 160 characters at a time or a snapshot at a time. I mean, you could do threads and have them long ass, captions and shit. But like, generally speaking, you're just presenting some aspect of yourself. And so I wonder if that in and of itself undermines or truncates the types of relationships or the types of sort of political connections or forms of comradeship that can form. So I just wanted to, chop it up about this. What y'all think?
I mean, so I think there's a distinction between the making friendships in real life and then having a relationship off social media. And I do think that there's definitely a need to have a relationship off social media. And I think it's weird in this time, and these, here we are approaching 2022, and most of us thought that we would be over COVID, and here we are in a new wave. And so we've adjusted to virtual life. And I think it has its pluses and minuses. On the one hand, virtual life has allowed us to connect to people that we might not have ever connected to in any real way. And I do think you can have meaningful virtual relationships with people, but I definitely think it has to be something beyond what happens on social media. Because I think, I know CBS, you have largely, and both of y'all, you largely work with BAP exclusively online, but you can have some decent relationships with people and work together and actually have some common political goals when you actually are working together in some capacity beyond what happens on social media. Now, the social media thing for a lot of people is hella performative. Like you said, most people are demonstrating whatever they think is the best versions of themselves. And there's very little that we know. I mean, we are very selective about what we put out on social media. Even those of us who think that we're oversharers, there's still things we're not sharing on social media. So I definitely think, there is something to having meaningful connections that social media just can't accomplish.
Yeah, I mean, I think the emphasis on social media particularly is really the point. Like, there's people who I've connected with, I eventually actually talk to on the phone or have a full conversation with, versus people who I just tweet with. Those are like totally different relationships. Like somebody who I might actually have a bond with, where we can talk about that, whatever goes beyond our politics. We could talk about our lives just in general and how that might mesh with our politics, versus someone who I just talk about movies or something because you tweet about that. Like, those are that person almost isn't even like I hate to say it, it's almost like they're not even a real person. It's like they're just kind of a caricature and we're both probably caricatures of each other. We just kind of engage on that little topic, and then that's that. I mean, I guess it's like in this kind of new environment, which isn't technically new. I mean, we've had social media for a while. The internet's been a thing for a while, but like now that people are more forced to be online, we have to think about like how that just changes the dynamics. And in a way, it is still material because material conditions have forced us online, right? Like it's not that this is just some random choice that people have made. But when it comes to things like Twitter, where you feel like you're part of some hive or something, you know, and then when things don't go your way, all of a sudden these loyalties you feel are broken that never probably really existed. I think that's when it's most detrimental. And I mean, I'll just name one particular beef. The black male studies versus black feminist thing going on or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not getting into that, or maybe we do, but I'm saying like you see how even that like isn't about necessarily everybody even being in those particular groups. Like it's just proxy wars. So some people just don't like bell hooks or something, and now they are in black male studies, or they defend black men, or they push back against them, and now they're feminists. And these people may not even have these affiliations in real life. They're not doing that type of work. They're not involved in that scholarship. They're not in that type of activism. But because they can pose themselves as that online, anything goes, right? So I think you have to also just have real life connections, like to test out whatever theory you truly are about, right? So whatever you're doing, you need to take that to the situation that you're in, and you can't. I don't think you can fully test anything out solely online, even beyond social media.
Yeah, and I think so. I think the distinction between having a relationship through technology or a mediated relationship versus social media, like that's an important distinction, because even with BAP, like I didn't come to BAP through social media. You know, like first of all, in 2019, or maybe even no 2018, 2017, I published some article where I wrote about BAP, right? And so I already knew about it. And then being involved in sort of webinars and events and with people who are in BAP is ultimately what got me in the organization. And then we had real life shit. We had several protests in real life. We went in March, remember, Layla, we went to the free Mumia protest, which was prompted by having been in BAP and the different people who are going to converge in that real life space. And so I think that distinction is important. And the other thing too is like, I don't mean to be this in an ableist way, because there are some people who literally can't be in them streets doing anything. And whether it's because of health issues, whether it's mobility, whether it's just issues of access. And so it's not like if you only have friends in a mediated way, like you ain't shit, you trapped in the metaverse or whatever. It's not that. It's really thinking about how my social media foster or encourage a particular type of ethics that make people relate to each other more harshly. Because and this reminds me of a tweet that I saw too. I think it was, her name is Big Relly, was like, y'all don't really be, how y'all interact with people online is not how you interact with them in real life, because your ass would have been mushed in the face. And I think that likewise, we can treat each other more harshly and more with more ethics of disposability, because it's through social media and because it's not in real life. And I count like phone and FaceTime and those things, not in real life, but of a different piece than like social media.
No, I think the disposability point is real though. I mean, it's just you can just tell somebody to fuck off, and you don't have to care about what they're saying. The person receiving it doesn't really have to care either. There's not necessarily a way of negotiating consequences like there are in real life. Like, real, like you said, in real life, I could just fight you, or other things can happen to you, right? But like online, other than whatever cancel culture is, if that's even a thing, right? Like, what can you really do? Like, you can just dunk on somebody, you can quote tweet them, we can trash you for a day, online bullying, basically. That's the best we can get to. But there's not an actual worked out way to be like, okay, you fucked up and you're accountable to us, so we can X, Y, and Z, we can deal with it that way. That does not exist when you're just behind an avatar. And I think it creates all this telephoning game too on social media. So like we were talking about last week with the gossiping thing, like there is the original, whatever the original issue is, almost always gets lost, and then it becomes all this stuff about this group is this, and you can't verify what anybody's really saying, and I think this whole group is trash, and it's like, what is your sample size is your timeline, and it's always funny. These people are, if the people that are claiming it's supposed to be academics or whatever, they have a terrible sense of what a sample size is because it's not a timeline, you know. But it's just like that's where this stuff goes. So I think it's definitely real, where it's just people become disposable. But I think the one of the bigger downsides that actually does translate to real life. Like, then your relationships with people in real life are more easy to just throw away because you can just go find more followers. You can just go find more people who are going to listen to you. Versus another time, people were going to tell you were full of shit, and there was nowhere else for you to go. So you had to actually own that. Now, if I go out in real life and everybody's like, "Nah, I don't fuck with you," well, I can just go online and find somebody who will, right? Like, even if they're gonna push the same bullshit I'm already on. I'm saying, if I'm that type of person. So I do think it sets a different relationality that we have to consider.
It also can encourage, just real quick, like hot behavior, like screenshotting shit, and I guess, you know, the aspects of doxing. Like, I think that needs to be taken into consideration as well. Like the way that then relationships, because they were forged in a particular way via social media, then the things that do happen like off social media, like via text or whatever, all of a sudden are free game for becoming public record, because then they're posted because there was some spat online. So it's like, it sows like distrust and a kind of like surveillance type culture that is kind of very problematic.
Or your thoughts from when you were 17 get brought up when you're 35. You know what I'm saying? And that just wasn't a thing once upon a time. Like, my thoughts at 17 probably wouldn't be approvable to anything I say today, you know. But now that can be like you said, be fair game.
Yeah, that was actually the intervention I was going to make, and for the most part, the way that those things can be taken out of context. On top of that, right? So there are some things that you actually say that can actually be fucked up in the moment, and then sometimes because of the amount of characters that you can use, or the way conversations get broken up, then some part of a conversation can be taken up, and then it can have its whole own life with the way that people deal with it on social media, because of the easy way it is to sort of chop these things up, share them, allow people to respond to them. So, I mean, that's my other concern, I think, about trying to talk about serious matters on social media, is because of that, because of the way things can be taken out of context. So I think just adding to your point, CBS, and to what
I think it's funny, because I remember like the most pernicious ways that this kind of like surveillance could happen back in the day was like three-way. You have somebody in secret listening in. It's like, we about to catch this person talking shit about you, and so you were, you know, you had somebody in silence on three-way or whatever, but you couldn't, you know what I mean? It was just the scale was smaller.
You want to explain to people what three-way is? Everybody may not be that old.
Three-way is when, I think now we just call it call merging. It's when you picked up your cordless, usually dialed up your friend and said, "Hold on, girl, I'm a caller. Be quiet, okay?" And then you clicked over, you called up this other person, "Hey, girl," or, you know, guy or Sib, whatever. Yeah. So what you doing? Hold on. Then you secretly click back over and you say, "Okay, so remember what you were saying about Shayna the other day?" And then it goes from there.
I feel like you have a lot of experience with this.
I was and probably still am a mean girl. I was a cheerleader, and I'm you know, gang affiliated via sorority. So what can I say?
Gang affiliated. Now, I think on the flip side, as someone who's from what they call a flyover state, Indiana, where the political consciousness is extremely low, and you know, you grow up indoctrinated with church bullshit, and that's the most political it often gets around here, or just neoliberal kind of like buy black business type shit, you know, or just be positive. Like, when that's the politics or the extent of it, it's not easy to find spaces that are like this or like so many other spaces. So on the other hand, I do think Twitter or any social media, I use Twitter often as far as a reference point, but any social media sometimes can help give you a venture into ideas that are often just not in your local space. I mean,
Absolutely.
we talk about joint organizations and stuff, and I agree with that. But at the same time, there are some of the organizations in these places that have just kind of been left to die, like in Indiana, the deep north. There's just not much. There's just not much to engage with. So you're not learning about communism, especially as Black people, by and large, unless you just know the right folks. It's just not an idea that's going to really get around to you in quote unquote real life, or I'll say offline, versus online. You can get exposed to some of these ideas. So it's a double-edged sword, because people who may not have organization to grow into these ideas don't necessarily know where to go with them so it can get out of hand, but at least they get exposed to it. But on the other side, like, you're searching for things, and for people who can realize very quickly, like, this ain't it. Or like I told y'all, even in college, like, I think CBS talked about, like, Black Agenda Report was something big for me too, because, like, I was saying Black Studies, we ain't had none of that. Really, any like critical theory classes, they were very far few and in between, even in my actual college. So to find this shit, I had to go to the library and I had to go online, and find the few people who rock with it, and then try to bring that back to the kind of day-to-day struggle that I'm involved with.
Yeah, and a couple things. The first is that, I think that social media, like technology, is a good servant and a poor master. So that's why it's also like, it's fine for that to be your starting point. But again, I think that part of the conversation is it has to develop beyond social media, right? And it also, and I think that perhaps, and I'm not sure, but perhaps there's a difference between folks. It might be generational in the sense that there's a particular type of relationality that a certain generation had prior to the internet and prior to social media. And then there's people who this is their primary mode of relating because they're born into it, so to speak, right? And so, like, I know that I'm just the type of person, and this is a combination of being in academia, my own personality, and just, I guess, the generation that I'm in. Like, if I read something I like, I just email the person, right? Like, or I hit them, I might DM them, whatever, but establish a different type of conversation. And in fact, like, I had a particular exchange online where somebody was going back and forth based on the conversation that we had with Treva. And I just, at a certain point, I was like, I deleted what I said, and I DM the person, because it's like, I'm just not invested in having these public battles. Like, that's just not the way I don't engage in that way on social media. And it's also like, if you want to have a real conversation, this is my response, and I'm happy to continue. But if this is just fucking grandstanding, like, I have a body of scholarship, and my ideas are there. You can check it out. You know what I mean? Like, so again, a lot of this has to do with how social media stages or curates how we relate to one another, and then that can shape the types of friendships and forms of comradely engagement that happen.
All right, y'all. So for this week's planting thoughts, we have a tribe ritual. This is a satin pothos, or the Syndapsis pictus. So this one is fairly easy to care for. So this particular in the family of pothos has like it's called a satin pothos because the leaves are satin. So this is not one of the ones that you would want to spray too much with any kind of oil, because you would lose some of the finish. But one of the things that's interesting about the pothos is that these are fairly easy plants to grow. They really can give a lot of pleasure because they can get pretty thick, they can vine. But the thing about this particular pothos, or pothos in general, is that they need a lot of bright indirect light. And they are a thriving plant, so they can survive without the most ideal conditions. But what happens when they do survive without the most ideal conditions is that they start to change. So if you give it too much direct sunlight, the leaves will burn. If you don't give it enough, the variation on the leaves starts to go away, right? And so there is this sweet spot, even in the wintertime, where you have to make sure to give just the right amount of attention to these types of plants to get them to continue to grow. I'm excited because these are, quite a few new leaves that are popping in here. But the thing that I think about, the thing that Pothos made me think about is that they are things that don't require a lot of special effort, but require steady attention in order to continue to thrive. So that is this week's plant for planting thoughts, the satin pothos.
All right, y'all. So for my rant today, I want to think about your president and the ways that we were beat over the head to vote for the more decent president, and the ways that people cheered decency and civility coming back into the fold after Trump. Well, here is a reflection of the decency of this administration. Part of this White House briefing that they gave said, we're intent on not letting Omicron disrupt work and school for the vaccinated. You've done the right thing and we'll get through this. For the unvaccinated, you're looking at a winter of severe illness and death for yourselves, your families, and the hospitals you may soon overwhelm. So here, decency is shaming. It's abdicating responsibility, is displacing the blame for the complete lack of effort and care and consistency that this administration has that this administration has demonstrated vis-a-vis getting a handle on this pandemic. Also, if we want to talk about decency, what about the ways that the West, the US in particular, has hoarded vaccines? And as many have noted, the vaccines that actually would be effective against Omicron, which is only to this point, the Pfizer vaccine and Moderna vaccine. But because the US was at the helm of being against waiving TRIPS requirements, these vaccines, the vaccines that have been distributed throughout the world to the extent that they have, are not the ones that actually would be effective against Omicron and probably against the next several mutations that are going to come up. So anyway, the moral of the story is we want to talk about decency, but in a racist, settler, colonial, capitalist let me start that little piece over. But the moral of the story is there is no way to have a decent administration in a racist, settler, capitalist, patriarchal, backward, plunderous society. And so all of that liberal dribble about civility just means that you want your oppression, your exploitation, your super exploitation, your expropriation, your plunder, and your wealth hoarding to be palatable. It doesn't mean that you want it to go away. And so get your shit together, because this is what decency means. This complete disregard for life, this complete abdication of responsibility. That's what the quote unquote decency means. And that's why y'all gonna lose in 2022 and 2024. So go cha-cha slide in line for that.
All right, y'all. So we have another interesting interview guest with us this week. We have Amandla Thomas Johnson. He is a British-born writer of African Caribbean descent. As a journalist, he has reported for a dozen countries, including Chile, Trinidad and Tobago, and Switzerland. He was based in Dakar, Senegal for 3 years, covering West Africa. He has worked for The Guardian, The Middle East Eye, The Daily Telegraph, Al Jazeera, BBC, Vice, and was trained at Channel 4. He is now pursuing a PhD at Cornell University's Department of Literatures in English. Please welcome Amandla Thomas Johnson with us today, y'all.
Hi.
Thank you so much for being here, Amandla.
Thank you for having me. Really, a real pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
So can you, Sharice, I meant to do this when I was reading the bio, but I didn't. So can you just, before you ask the question, can you just say the book and I'll hold it up?
Okay, so here's what I'll do. Okay, so Amandla, we are so excited to have you here to speak about your book, Becoming Kwame Ture. Okay, so, but before we get into that, or I guess let's just launch right in, right? So can you start by telling us about how you came to this project, what made you develop an interest in this kind of work, and who is the audience for your book, because it's quite accessible. It's quite a thin and accessible rendering of Kwame Ture. And then also talk a little bit about what you hope to accomplish with the publication. And then if that's not enough, your father is the great, or was the great Buzz Johnson. And so can you talk about how your text links to your father's own publication house and his work on Claudia Jones?
Okay, sure, yeah. Thank you once again, and amazing questions to start off with. So this project really started, I think it was back in 2018. I was living in Dakar, Senegal, and there was the opening of the historic Museum of Black Civilizations, basically, right? So this is a big museum, you know, holding art and, you know, other exhibits from across the African diaspora. It had been dreamt up by Leopold Senghor, but it was only actually built in 2018, right? So like 60 years after, you know, Senegal won its independence. And there was a big gathering of people from across the diaspora, you know, people like Professor Carol Boyce Davis, Professor Leah Wilton, Professor Carolyn Cooper from Jamaica, all gathering in Dakar. And one of the people who was there was Professor Greg Thomas, and at Tufts University, I believe. And he had just put on an exhibition on Kwame Ture in Conakry, in Guinea, Conakry. And I started to talk to him, and he was like, you know, you should try and check it out, get down there and see what you could do. So he put me in touch with Kwame Toure's son, Boka Toure's eldest son. And from there, Boka put me in touch with some of Kwame Toure's comrades that were living in Senegal. And, you know, I didn't really have a plan, to be honest. And I just thought to myself, you know, I've come to Senegal, I've been here for a few months. Let me try and connect with these people, right? These are Pan-Africanists, these are people I want to kind of learn from and all that. So I decided to chill with them. And every time this comrade, Sekou Mbaki, he's called, every time he came to Dakar, I would go and see him, and we'll just talk more and more and more. And then one day I was like, you know what, it was almost on a whim. I said to myself, I want to go to Guinea, right? I want to go and see what it's all about. And I was feeling a bit adventurous, so I decided, you know, I want to go there by road. So I went to get in, like, the sort of rickety sort of bus, and just try it. It took me, like, in total, the trip was about 50 hours on road from Dakar to Conakry. It was pretty rough, but enjoyable nonetheless. And again, I got there. I had no plan really. I was like, let me just try and see if I can speak to some Kwame Toure's comrades. Doors just flung wide open basically as soon as I mentioned his name. You know, I was able to meet Sekou Toure's wife. I was able to meet, like, government ministers. I had access to the archive. And when I got to the archive, really, and I saw the material there, that's when I decided, yo, like, there's something here I can try and write and build on. And so it kind of, snowballed from there. But I didn't really have a big plan. I was just following my curiosities, really. And this is kind of where it led. I mean, I should also add that Chimurenga, who published the book, they wanted it to be a book, right? I mean, that, they literally they said to me, they were like, I think we could do this as a sort of like a small booklet or a book. So that again allowed me to sort of explore these themes in a lot more sort of detail than if it was just like a simple article. So about you mentioned the audience. So for me, I think the audience for me were were sort of people who were sort of working in struggle, basically, right? I wanted it to be accessible, short, straight to the point, and something like a little handbook, basically, that you could read and sort of say that like gain some lessons from, effectively, right? And I think I was sort of writing against some of the narrow framings of struggle that around these days. So like the kind of nation-centric stuff, the sort of like the lack of internationalism, the erasure of Africa, right, in how we construe struggle, the ignoring of the Caribbean, the ignoring of material analysis. I was trying to really show how like Toure defied a lot of those boundaries you place around our politics today, basically. So yeah, you mentioned my dad, my father, Buzz Johnson, and so my father is from Trinidad and Tobago, like Toure as well. And my mother also grew up in Trinidad as well. And my father was the publisher at Carrier Press, basically. It was a publishing house, London-based, that published books from across the African diaspora. One of the things he used to say to me when I was young was he always used to speak about Kwame Toure, but he always used to talk about him as Kwame Toure, not Stokely Carmichael. And he would emphasize that he took on the names of Kwame Nkrumah and Sekou Toure. I didn't know much about, you know, about him at that point in time, but it's something that kind of stuck with me, and you know, I kind of remember, and he used to say, you know, he was a Trinidadian, you know, like me, you know that sort of thing, right? So I think that you know, kind of stuck with me. But I think in terms of my dad's or my parents' sort of work, I think, you know, their work was internationalist in scope always, right? I was never really brought up as like a British person, right? And I don't really classify myself as British in that way, right? You know, I was playing, you know, I was playing carnival when I was 5. I had, you know, I was sent off to like Ghanaian African dance classes. You know, my mum ran like a Pan-African Saturday school and all that sort of stuff, right? And then my dad was publishing like, you know, Caribbean women poets like Aintu Pearl Springer. He was publishing books about racism and police violence in our neighborhood in London. But then he was also publishing like poems from the national liberation movement in Namibia, right? So there was a broad sort of sweep there. And then, you know, my parents were supporting, you know, political movements in St. Vincent and the Grenadines in the Caribbean, and of course the Grenadier Revolution as well. So I think that sort of laid the groundwork for me to like think about Kwame Toure as an international figure, and not just one who's just Trinidadian or just American, or, you know, or even just African. Yeah.
Thank you for that. I should say, before I ask the next question, I want to be transparent even about my own interest. You know, for me, as both the child of members of the AAPRP and a current member of the AAPRP GC, you know, you mentioned Bob Brown being at Kwame's side when he passed away, and even my father was there for the funeral in '98. So Kwame is a figure, like an uncle-like figure in my own life. And so I'm thinking about sources, and the reason why I'm asking you this question is because even for us, like there's been a lot of conversations inside of the party about, one, what it means to write a history of Kwame Toure. And then a lot of time what comes up is to write a history of Kwame Toure without writing a history of the party, you know, becomes a contentious kind of thing, right? And so I'm interested from your own perspective about the types of authoritative primary sources, like who were you able to talk to? Who did you gain access to? How did you decide what to use? And then, you know, how do you navigate contradictory depictions or issues that maybe certain people have? What do you do when you come up with like controversial stories? And then I should say, just more explicitly, to what degree do past and present members of the party contribute to your knowledge about Kwame Toure and this project?
Yeah, that's a deep question. I appreciate you having that connection to Kwame. And I think one of the amazing things about it is that, like, I mean, I've been around the world, like, researching this book, right? I spoke to people in Mali, like on the ground in Mali, the Gambia, Guinea, Senegal, Trinidad and Tobago, and then London, and then New York as well, right? And a lot of people, you know, talk about, you know, Kwame Toure as like a kind of uncle figure, right? But in different ways. Like, some people, he's an uncle to others, he's a brother. You know, he's so many things in one. And I really appreciate you saying that. I think a key source, the archive in Guinea, was a key source for me. I didn't know what to expect, and I just, you know, it's like a room, and it's just like papers and papers and papers and books. I just dived in, and I just found some themes that really spoke to me, namely the party's attempts to form a women's wing in the early 80s. And his work supporting the Palestinians, they kind of spoke to me, and I was like, okay, I was there for like 5 days basically, and when I found those themes like early on, I was like, okay, let me just look for those themes. Basically, if I have those 3 themes, I can write something based on that. So I just looked for those themes rather than trying to get, like, you know, everything down, which I couldn't do. I thought, let me just focus on that, and I think I was able to do that. So it's kind of internationalism. His sort of, you know, his work, the party, which is important. And then also there were some documents related to his time in Guinea. But importantly for his time in Guinea, I was able to access some of his political comrades, you know, from his days in Guinea. So this included Madame Toure, who was the wife of Sekou Toure. And she was fascinating to speak to. I mean, first of all, I met her in Villa Sili, right? Villa Sili is Kwame Nkrumah's former residence in Guinea. And actually what happened was, I actually arrived to meet a comrade, a different comrade of Kwame Ture. And I got there, and the comrade said, "Oh, you know, come inside and say hello to this person." And so I was thrust in front of Secretary's wife without, I hadn't prepared, you know, I looked a mess, like, you know, all that sort of stuff. And she was really important because she was married to Sekou Toure since the 1950s, right? So before Guinea won its independence. And for those of you who don't know, Guinea's independence story is quite unique among the former French colonies in West Africa, right? In that Guinea under Sekou Toure broke away from the French sphere and was severely punished for doing so.
They took the light bulbs, the toilet seats, or copper wiring, everything.
Right, exactly, right. And then even they, when Guinea launched its own currency, the French launched an Operation Persil, where they basically flooded the country with counterfeit notes to crash the economy. And so Sekou Toure had to turn to Kwame Nkrumah for a loan, basically, to keep the country's economy afloat. And so Madame Toure, she was there when Charles de Gaulle was coming to meet Sekou Toure and talk about, you know, trying to convince them to stay within the French zone and all this. So she was giving me all these details. She spoke about the fact that when her husband passed away in '84, I think it was, and she was carried off into imprisonment, Kwame went to visit her, basically. She was very, very grateful for that. So, you know, there were other comrades as well with whom I spoke, but also what was so important for me was actually to go to his neighborhood and speak to the ordinary people on the ground, basically, right? And that's really when I felt I got to know who he was, because I think that there's one thing dealing with, you know, presidents and diplomats and heads of state and all that, but I think your character really comes out when you're dealing with the ordinary folk, right? And this is a guy who claims to be like a socialist and grassroots organizer. So how does he actually deal with the ordinary folk? People had stories about him. I mean, this is 20 years after he passed away, and people were talking about him like he was almost still there, right? They had stories about how he would, whenever he would return to Guinea, he would bring like a whole suitcase of t-shirts or underwear and give them out to people. You know, people. I mean, there were tears in people's eyes, actually. You know, when they spoke about him. So I think those were kind of my main sources. I'll just jump to the other AAPRP sources as well, as we're sort of on there. So I mentioned his name before. So Sekou Mbaki, who lives in Senegal, was a comrade of Kwame Toure. And Sekou Mbaki was born in Haiti. He met Kwame Toure in the 70s. He was at university, I think in Kentucky. And then he then became a main organizer for the party in DC, basically. He then went to live in Guinea-Bissau in the 80s on party business. And then he moved to Guinea-Conakry, where Kwame Toure was. And he lived with him in the same house, actually, for the last 9 or 10 years of his life. And what would happen, basically, with Sekou Mbaki, whenever he came to Dakar, I would go and see him. And naturally, the people that were around him, this included the brothers of Omar Blondin Diop, a very important Senegalese radical. They all knew Kwame Toure. So I would just sit there, basically, listen to them, reminiscing, talking. I would record the conversations, ask some questions. Yeah, it was just, you know, nothing. It wasn't like a formal sort of thing. I would just sit there and for hours maybe, and they'll be talking, you know, sharing a few drinks or whatever. And that's how I also, you know, was able to absorb a lot of stuff. Two other people who are really important for this, Fazia Poku and Rima Diallo. So these are two former party members based in London, basically. And they were really invaluable in sort of helped me to understand the global dimensions and the challenges of running a party across a number of continents. They had both been to Guinea to visit Kwame Toure as well. And they also, you know, were able to sort of, you know, give me something about the sort of UK context of the AAPRP and, you know, and the sort of organizing there. And Fazia in particular was able to share her experiences of being a woman in the party, which was like really, really important. So you mentioned some of the contradictory depictions that I came across. So I think I was working against a certain reading of Kwame Ture, you know, from the off, right? So, with all due respect, I was disappointed by Penny Joseph's book on Kwame Ture.
You don't need to.
Like, what respect? No, don't get my brain started. Anyway.
He basically, I mean, as I'm sure you're aware, right? He basically ends Kwame Ture's life in 1969 when he's 27, right? And the guy lives for another 30 years. So effectively, like Kwame Ture actually is only in America for like 16 years. 16 years. That's like a quarter of his life, actually, right? And he ends him like basically in 69 when him and Makeba jump on the plane to Guinea. So,
but not even just that, right? He even because he spends so many of his years, one, living in Guinea, in between Conakry and Dalaba, he's also thinking, like, people want to remember him for Black Power, but he literally says towards the end of his life that Pan-Africanism is Black Power. Like that is how his own thinking has developed. So even for people to focus on that moment is just to rob him of so much of the work that he actually did for so much longer in his life.
Exactly.
It reminds me of Du Bois, like how Du Bois said, you know, he has this letter where he says, it's as if I died in 1903, like after writing Souls of Black Folk. And he, you know, he lived for 60 more years after that. So it's a similar thing that people entrap these great thinkers into a particular like era or epoch of their life and their thinking to the detriment of understanding them as a full person. But
exactly. And you know, we all know that there's been a massive effort to like rewrite, you know, the 60s and the main figures, the main protagonists of the 60s, right? And I was writing against that because like you can't, like, don't try and like put Kwame Ture into some like, you know, some American like nationalist framework. Like it just doesn't, that's just ridiculous. That's completely what he did not stand for, like, you know. So I really have to push back against that. So there were other tensions that I was working with as well, right? So one of the things that Kwame Ture goes down in history is as a misogynist, right? And this refers to a comment he made basically. He was like, this was like in the early 60s.
It
was a long time ago.
The context was very informal.
Very informal.
It was an internal meeting, right? They were discussing some internal documents.
My understanding was it was even post the meeting. It was even after that they were just like sitting around literally shooting the shit. And that came up and that was an off the cuff comment that he made. That's my understanding.
Yeah, no, exactly.
And go ahead for our viewers what the off the cuff comment that he made.
Yeah. So basically, as you said, there was a meeting of some sort, and someone basically asked the question. So, what is the role of women for this particular organizing that we're trying to do? And he said the role of women is to be prone, basically, right? Right. And
on their backs is what prone means for those who don't know.
Right. And so there, you know, there was some laughter and all that sort of stuff. So I spoke to someone called Muriel Tillinghast, basically, right? And she was a member of SNCC back in the 60s. She was actually the head of one of the I've forgotten the name of it, but it was an organization. She was at Howard with Kwame Ture, right? She was at Howard with Kwame Ture, right? Toure, when he got to Howard, he joined the organization that she was leading, right? So she knew him inside out from Howard and then onto SNCC. And she was like, I've never seen anything that would indicate to me that he was a misogynist. I worked with this guy night and day, right? We were under pressure. We were getting hosed, locked up, all this sort of stuff. Like we were living in close proximity for years and years and years. I never saw anything like that, right? So this again is how these figures have been rewritten, right? In such a way as to sort of disappear them from history books. The other thing that comes up with Kwame Ture is this idea that he was anti-Semitic, right? Now let's think about this, right? When during the 6 Day War, 67, this is 1967, when Israel occupies, you know, this is the war basically where, in a way, it kind of finishes off what it didn't finish off when it started in its founding, basically, and it occupies East Jerusalem, occupies parts of Egypt, Jordan, Syria, right? And basically, SNCC really is the first organization to come out, civil rights organization, because the Nation of Islam was saying this stuff already, but the first civil rights organization to come out in support of the Palestinians, right? And this is a monumental moment in American politics. I mean, in some ways, you could even argue that they introduced into the mainstream, right, this idea that you can support Palestinian rights, right? This is a big deal. And of course, Kwame Ture he's the head of the organization as this is happening. And Ethel Minor is another person who's involved in that as well. And so from that period, all the way literally until his death, right, he is one of the most vocal supporters of Palestinians. And some people even argue that he is the most vocal non-Palestinian, non-Arab, supporter of the Palestinians anywhere, right? And what's so interesting about him though is that whereas SNCC was effectively shut down, right? After it came out with that statement, right? And as
the Vietnam War. So it was the coupling of their coming out against the Vietnam War and
right.
the Palestinian question,
from
my understanding.
But it was them liberal white Jews that pulled their money after they determined that they were so-called anti-Semitic, that really effectively shut SNCC down. So like they started to basically make them unable to operate, and that's because they were too reliant on that money.
Sure. And I think that what's remarkable is that, like, I think in our sort of age now, right, like as soon as you step out of line and you say something against Israel and you're slapped with, you're anti-Semitic or the first thing you do is go and apologize and go and grovel and go and say something. Kwame Ture never did that. Like for 30 years, he never ever did that. I mean, he was completely.
Well, he was very clear that it was illogical to say that as a supporter of the Palestinians. First of all, Semite is a linguistic. It's a category that involves many things, and to be pro-Palestinian is that Palestinians are Semites. So I don't even know what they're talking about.
And he did the whole rundown of the Balfour Declaration and the construction of the whole narrative that was foundational to Israel. So.
Yeah.
Well, he had nothing to apologize for.
And that Zionism don't have nothing to do with religion, because what's his name? What's the dude? He was a damn atheist. What's his name? The founder.
Balfour. Isn't it?
Herschel. Theodore, yes.
Theodore Herzl. Yeah. So that was like a key argument of his, right? He would say that, Judaism as a religion he loves, or he appreciates as someone who comes from Christian biblical background, but Zionism is a political ideology which is separate. That was a key thing he would say, and so he goes down as having this sort of anti-Semitism stuff like that. So I was also trying to work against that and to show the legitimacy of his work basically when it comes to Palestinians, right? Now the other thing as well, and all these tensions are inside the text, right? I thought about them as I was writing it. As I knew I needed to navigate them in some ways. The other one is Sekou Toure and his relationship to Sekou Toure. One of the things that I did in the book basically was I interviewed someone who was tortured under Sekou Toure's regime, right? And this was I think this was quite this part of the book challenged me the most actually. So I mean the story was that my home in London, we had someone from Guinea who was staying at my house basically. When I went to Guinea, this was like 5, 6, 7 years afterwards, I texted him and said, I'm in Guinea, like, is there anyone you think I should meet? I'm writing something on Kwame Ture. And it's like, meet my uncle. My uncle was tortured under Sekou Toure's regime. So I went to meet him, and he explained, the horrific like torture he went through and everything. And then to my surprise, he sort of accused Kwame Ture of not doing enough to speak up about his treatment. And he sort of said like, Kwame came from the United States and was defending human rights there of Black people. Why didn't he do anything for us, right? And so I realized that there was this tension, and I spoke to family members and stuff, and there was a perception among some people basically that within Guinea that whereas he would speak out against abuses elsewhere, he wasn't doing so inside of Guinea, and that was you then realize, like, why is that, for example, right? And you realize that he's in a very difficult political situation, in that he literally cannot travel in Eastern Bloc countries. I think former French colonies are like banning him. Commonwealth countries are banning him, right? Guinea is literally it's like literally the only place he really can stay in. And Toure has literally, saved his life, and he's taken on his name, right? And so there's that aspect, but there's also the other aspect that Kwame Ture completely believes in the Sekou Toure regime, and he sort of sees this as being, he's seen the realpolitik of this, right? That sometimes to defend the revolution, you need to sometimes defend the revolution, right? You know what I'm saying?
That was what I was gonna say. I mean, I don't, not to diminish anybody's experience with torture, but there's also a number of things when you are attempting to create a political project that the world is against. And one of the main ways that the people outside of the country are able to attack their project is by locking in to sympathizers, opposition sympathizers inside the country. And so then that becomes a very real test of the revolutionary project, both in terms of how you deal with that type of dissent, but then it also doesn't get measured up in the same types of way that the US is torturing people every day and locking people away for the rest of their lives and not feeding them and all kinds of stuff.
It's a similar discourse that we see it in Cuba. Like, it's always, right? It's always human right. I mean, again, and this is not to say that contradictions don't exist, but it's literally it happens in all of these socialist or non-aligned or critical regimes that are or governments that are critical of the West, is this tension. And it's like, this is the reality of being a socialist state in a capitalist world economy, right? Exactly. Those contradictions are going to persist, right, wrong, or indifferent. And so we have to be discerning when we think about the role of the nation state or the role of prisons, the way that they operate in socialized countries versus capitalist Western countries, right? Like, so we have to be discerning with our abolition and with our discourse. We have to understand what's actually going on. So
sure. No, absolutely. And I think that was an interesting sort of thing to sort of navigate as well, and I think as well, like I mean from speaking to Kwame Toure's family, I mean, this was something that actually got to him himself, right, personally, right? He was it's something he struggled with as well personally, is kind of what I understand. But I mean, I think in some ways it kind of challenged me to be more critical in how I wrote this, and to not just like write it as a kind of hagiography where I just ignore some of these things or I kind of gloss over them. It kind of forced me to stop in the road and sort of like, okay, like, let me try and go into this in more detail and explain it, for myself, but also for the reader as well. So that was I think those were the main tensions that I came across when writing it.
Thank you. And so sort of in keeping with thinking about your approach and methods. So there was a roundtable, the African American Intellectual History Society a couple of years ago did a roundtable on Gerald Horne's work. And I wrote about what I called the Horne biographical method, in which he used biography as a method to interrogate broader political, social, and economic contexts and phenomena, and to illuminate connections among freedom fighters, organizations, and institutions that sort of disrupt this like great man or great woman approach that is often taken in history and in even in crafting biographies. And as someone who has also written a biography and tried to take on this approach, I wondered, how does your focus on Toure's life allow for an accessible entry point to discuss key events throughout the African continent, including in Mozambique and Guinea-Bissau, South Africa, Ghana, and Guinea, as well as in Palestine, the US, and elsewhere? And then, and who are some of the important figures? You mentioned this already, but like, what are some of the organizations and institutions you discuss that shaped who Toure was in struggle and in community with?
Yeah, sure. So I think that you know, Toure is around for so long, and he's traveling to so many places, that in a way we can understand the times through his life, right? You know, I mean, from the 60s, he's already traveled to like Vietnam, he's traveled to like Tanzania, Algeria, he's been to London, he's been all over the place, right? And you know, like, you know, wherever he travels, there's certain things that kind of like erupt sometimes, right? So in London, basically, the Black Power struggle starts like from his visit to London. Like it takes root from there, basically, right? You know, when he's in Tanzania with Nyerere, there's a bit of, you know, controversy happening. He goes to Algeria as well. So I think like we can understand like kind of you know, global solidarities and all these sort of things through his life. Well, I guess what else is interesting though is that like the years he spends in Guinea is really a time where we're seeing the sort of like the counter-revolutionary forces gathering steam basically across Africa, right? This isn't a glorious period for the global Black freedom struggle, right? And so you also see him swimming against the tide, right? And for me, that's really fascinating. Like, how and why do you keep on going when you're swimming in there and you're seeing neoliberalism coming at you, right? You're seeing Reagan coming at you. You're seeing Thatcher. You're seeing intervention in Grenada. You're seeing Sekou Toure's death happening, right? You know, what do we do when the revolution is kind of going wrong, right? And do we give up or do we carry on? And I think that's one thing that I really found amazing from like reading about him in this period. I mean, you see this even in the 90s, right? That he sets up a global anti-Zionist front basically in 1991, and from the moment it's created, it's encountering disaster basically, right? So this front basically was to basically, you know, encourage Africans, educate Africans about the dangers of Zionism as he saw it. Within 2 months, Nigeria recognizes Israel, right? Right. So that's a complete disaster. The most populous Black country, which has a large Muslim population that could be, you know, enthusiastic anti-Zionists, recognizes Israel. A few months after that, the Soviet Union collapses, right? And yet Toure is still organizing. Like we see him contacting activists in India to try and join the front. 1993, the Oslo Accords are signed, right? So the PLO recognizes Israel. And so even after that, Toure is still organizing for the Palestinians, even though some of the Palestinians themselves have given up on armed struggle and the sort of organizing that he stands for, right? So I really found it interesting how he's intersecting with some of the struggles, some of the movements, some of the sort of like, some of the difficulties really that are taking place in sort of global struggle. You mentioned some of the figures that he's sort of interacting with. I think, you know, Toure is working with, or the AAPRP, and I think it's important to, you know, to say this, that, you know, yes, Toure is an outstanding figure, but he's also a part of a collective, which is the party, the AAPRP, and which is a force in its own right, right? Which is why I included a section in the book about it. He was an outstanding organizer, as we know, but he was part of a whole. And there were many other outstanding organizers that were part of that party and which we don't really know about, not yet anyway, right? So I think that's an important thing as well, that he's part of a collective, and it's not just this figure, you know, who stands on his own 2 feet, you know, by himself, right? But some of the people who he sort of works with in this period, I mean, he's working with the, you know, the Indigenous American movement. He's working with Sinn Féin in Ireland. He strikes up a sort of like a relationship with someone called Fatima Bernawi. Fatima Bernawi is an Afro-Palestinian militant, basically. And you know, there's some correspondence between the two as well. And she appears to be quite influential on his, you know, on his thinking too. So he's you know, he's in his archive. You see that he's in constant communication. I even saw him, you know, corresponding with someone called Lester Lewis. Lester Lewis is someone from my neighborhood in London, right? He's was an activist. He passed away some years ago. From my neighborhood in London, he's like, they're talking like about, you know, Pan-Africanism and having, you know, even arguing even over, you know, correspondence. So he's communicated with so many people around the world, and which allows him to also have a broad understanding of what's happening in different parts of the world as well.
The point you made about him being understood as a member of the AAPRP and later is really important, because even when you listen to Kwame speak, one of his kind of rhetorical strategies or devices is to always refer to himself as we.
Our central task, as we see it, is the organization of the masses of our people. We see that our people everywhere are disorganized. And rather than people come to tell us what is the problem and what is the solution, they tell us everything other than organizing the people.
And that we that he's speaking about is always the party, right? It's sometimes a broader we, like as in we as in people, but he's talking about the work of the party. And it's also important to not diminish that, because what is his, after Black Power, what is his biggest rallying cry? It's organized. True. That is the primary thing that he will say. And so that for Kwame to, the way that he existed in the world was to think about himself as a part of an organization and in relationship to other people all the time. One of the stories that he always tells, that he's like, you know, I can go anywhere in the world because I'm of the people and I'm with the people. I will always be hosted by the people. So right. I can go anywhere in the world with 25 cents in my pocket and I can still eat and I can still have somewhere to sleep, right? But so that, you know, so I think that even in, you know, I think it's really important, the work that you're trying to do with the booklet, to think about those last 30 years of his life, but that is so important to, I think, the work that he was attempting to do at that point. But shifting gears just a little bit to your work as a journalist. So I'm curious about this, and maybe even this is connected to the book project, because sometimes, you know, we've talked a lot on the show. Sometimes we do work as an intellectual project, something to engage with, and sometimes we do work because we are actually committed to, so we do a biography of a person because we're actually committed to the type of work they themselves were doing, right? And I think that's connected to the question that Sharice just asked about, you know, how do you use the biographical method as a sort of proxy for engaging other things. But I wanted you to tell us a little bit more about, as a journalist, how do you see your work and your responsibility to be either different or the same or connected to the work of academics, intellectuals, and activists and organizers?
Yeah. I think that as a journalist, you're very much making very quick interventions, right? We don't always have the depth of the academic or the intellectual, but we're trying to bring a voice to the fore.
Tell that to your girl, your 16, 19 girl. Like, you don't got the range, sis. Anyway.
we don't always have the, you know, the depth, you know, to bring something forward, in the same way like an academic or intellectual would. But I think we're opportunists, right? And when opportunity rises, we can be quick and get something out there, bring up a voice that hasn't been heard before and get something out there. And then I think as well, like, a journalist can also reach quite a wide audience, right? There's a directness and a plainness to the way we work as well. You know, we got to be quick. We got to be, you know, we have to capture. There's such an emphasis on capturing people's attention, I think. I've personally found it a really powerful way to challenge you know, hegemonic like narratives that are out there, right? My sort of journalism, I guess, has sort of been sort of like underbelly journalism, like, you know, I kind of, you know, I don't really talk to like government ministers and all that sort of stuff. Like, I mean, I do if I need to, but that's not
when you're talking to a former head of state's wife. No.
former head of state. I mean, you need to get a bigger picture. What I'm trying to say is that when I talk about politics, if I describe myself as a political journalist, my politics is not the politics of Congress or of Westminster or of the Senate, right? My politics are the social movements on the ground. You know, that's kind of what I'm saying. And you know, this idea of kind of comforting the afflicted and afflicting the comfortable, that's kind of like how I kind of see it. But I think journalists, this is what one person described it. I think like our job is to like, we kind of like dig up the raw slags of information for writers of higher sensibilities to work on. So we do the dirty legwork, the hustling, the hassling, the whatever. And then others, we put it out there, then others can kind of build on it, I think, you know? I think that's an important thing that kind of journalists do. Yeah, hope that answers the question. Yeah.
But so just to follow up on this before I ask the last question, like what are the ethics of that? What are the sort of ethical concerns that, because if you're engaging the underbelly, you're digging up the sort of raw material, which is often people's lives, right? Yeah. It's people's day-to-day experiences. It's you're talking to people who they don't get remunerated, and like I don't know that y'all get cashed out either, quite honestly, unless you're oh girl and whomever else. But like, you know, so I just wonder, like, what are the ethics of like a journalism, and is that related at all to the ethics of telling somebody's life story, right? Especially somebody like Kwame Ture, who, like Malcolm X, very many people are very invested in how that story is told and have their own narratives. And so anything you have to say about that?
Yeah. I think I've tried to like to work in such a way where there is mutual benefit, right? I'm not writing a story because I just want to, you know, get a commission and like, you know, get my name, get another byline on an article. I want to write a story because it matters to the people that I'm writing about, you know, and or at least the cause that they're invested in is I'm in some way bringing that to light in some way, right? So I think while there might not be kind of remuneration, there is something that I can do for them, which is to highlight their cause. And like, you know, for example, I wrote a piece about Black Mauritanians who were expelled from Mauritania into Senegal, basically. I wrote it a few years ago. And I mean, this is basically the only piece in English written about them. They were basically expelled in the 1980s. And this is like really the first piece in English written about this, right? And after it was written, some congressmen or whatever, they wrote to like, you know, the Secretary of State in the US. They took from my article and sort of said basically that we need to do something about this and, you know, recognize the plight of these people. I'm not saying that like, you know, that's like an important thing, but I guess what I'm trying to say is that like these journalism can have an afterlife and can inform debates, inform policy, perhaps, you know, and can be used as evidence. You know, like it sounds silly, but it's almost like you know, the way we look at the world is almost as though like nothing happens unless it's written about, or unless it's video, or unless it's recorded, right? Or unless, you know, it's that sort of thing. So you kind of make something visible that can be taken forward and used in other ways. I think that you spoke about ethics, and it's super tricky. I mean, look, you know, as a Black journalist working in Africa, right? You know, I'm coming from the West, right? At the same time, right? And there's certain preconceptions that I bring to work in the global South or in Africa or elsewhere that I have to be mindful of as well, right? And it can be really tricky. Like, you know, when you're working with marginalized communities, when you're working with like, say, like Muslim communities, and, you know, there's Orientalism, you know, you gotta really kind of be on your toes about that, and be very careful. And the way I see it is that like I kind of write with people, I write with communities. So like I make sure that before it goes out that they're happy with what's in there. And if they're not happy, then I'm going to change it. And if it's published and they're still not happy, I'm going to fight to get it changed. You know, like that's kind of how I work, because my intention is to be of benefit to them. It's not just to get a scoop that, you know, everyone's going to, you know, I'm going to win awards for or something like that. You know, awards would be nice, but that's not my intention, really. You know what I mean? Yeah.
And journalism is so important. Like Ida B. Wells, Claudia Jones, W.B. Du Bois, William Alpheus Hunton. Like, there's a reason why all of these organizations have some sort of newsletter, periodical, or whatever. Like, it is really, really important. And it's not, and historically, especially the sort of Black radical journalism has not been apart from the scholarship, right? And
right.
You know,
Exactly.
and so I think it's important. But always the ethical question, even it I think undergirds the journalism work as much as the academic work, right? And there ain't no IRB in journalism, you know.
Right.
And so it's just always interesting. So okay, so in terms of the last questions, speaking of the relationship between journalism and sort of academic scholarship, so you recently transitioned from journalism on the continent to academia in the belly of the beast, the US. So what prompted this move?
Yeah.
And then what might your previous work, so your journalism work, bring to bear on your academic study? And then what do you ultimately hope to accomplish by getting a PhD? And then do you plan to continue on with your research on Kwame Ture?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've gone from the underbelly to the belly of the beast itself, right?
Right. The nutsack, from the underbelly to the nutsack.
Literally, because you also came to the US, so you're in it and you're of it.
You know, it's funny, like, because so, like, I mean, a year and a half ago, I was living in Dakar. I was thinking to myself, you know what, like, Dakar is like, even Dakar is too much. It's too much Babylon. I want to go deeper into the bush. And then a year and a half later, I'm in Iraq. You know, I think that I have certain, like, long-term goals that I want to achieve, and you know, for better or for worse, coming here, you know, I'm studying with you know, some of the finest scholars, really, when it comes to Africa and African diaspora. Professor Cara Boyce Davis, for example. You know, but others, you know, like, you know, the other scholars here, there's Professor Russell Rickford, there's Professor Jodie Bird, like, you know, there's some amazing scholars here, right? So even within these institutions, you know, in the sort of like the citadels of imperialism, you do find you know, individuals and spaces where you can really engage with, like, radical scholarship, right? And I knew I couldn't do that in the UK.
An oasis in the desert.
An oasis in the desert, right? Right. And I knew I couldn't do that in the UK. America, being what it is, has funding, right? And so that was obviously, like, something that I sort of think, you know, the thing is, as a writer, right, as a journalist, is and doing the work that I'm doing, is that you're always looking for the next gig. You know for a fact that to do this sort of work is difficult. Like, it takes sacrifice. Like, you take a financial hit. Like, you know, you can't really live it up. Do you know what I mean? And so, like, you're always looking for the next gig that can allow you to do your writing and to pursue your curiosities, you know, at the end of the day. And this kind of spoke to me as one of those opportunities. And for me, I'm still pursuing the struggles and the visions that I've had as a journalist, but just now as an academic. I think one of the things that was shifting for me when I was living in Senegal was, I think, in a way, I was finding, like, my kind of authorial voice. And that came from writing the book, I would say, as well, that there were things that I wanted to say, or things that I felt I wanted to say that I couldn't really say as a reporter, right? And, you know, I started writing more columns. I was doing podcasts. I was writing essays, and so, like, you know, I just, something else was coming out, basically, I was expressing myself in ways that were exceeding what I could do as a reporter. And I thought that doing a PhD would allow me to kind of like work those things out even more, right? I would say as well, you know, you know, as a Black person, let's be quite honest here, right? It's like we have to try like so much harder, right, to be able to have a voice, for our voices to be heard, right? And a PhD was also part of that as well. Is also a part of that as well, right? That we sometimes have to be overqualified to say something that any old other person can say, right? So that was also a part of it as well. So I think there are many reasons, but you know, like some of the discussions, like, you know, online and stuff, like some of the arguments and the squabbles, I just thought to myself, like, some of us just need to read a bit more. Like, you know, I didn't want to be that guy who was just like on Twitter.
Whoa, read how elitist of you, how class antagonist of you, how literist of you. Reading? We supposed to read to know things? The nerve of you.
You were hitting the button. You didn't know you were hitting the hot button.
The nerve of you to read. Oh, read, Nas.
But yeah, like, you know, like I think we live, like, I hate to say it, but we live in quite like anti-intellectual kind of thing, and that's not to say that everyone needs to be a professor, but let's face it, like even like grassroots activists, they were self-taught. They've always been reading. You know, you don't need to have a PhD in order to do this work, right?
You don't know, you're running down our last like several weeks of shoot the shit, things we've been talking about. You may not even be aware of that, but these are ongoing conversations for us. So but I will say this, even though I know I'm interrupting you, but I don't know if you answered the question quite yet about whether or not you will continue on with this work, but I do hope that it is something that as you increase your credentials, but really increase what you have access to, that it is something that you'll take up. Because I don't necessarily think, like Cherie said, that people are very, 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 very invested in the story of Kwame Ture, and there's no way that you can do a single biography that folks are going to be happy with. Because even the one with Thelwell, that was before he even passed away, and even that one still doesn't encompass so much of his later life, right? In, you know, in important ways. So I'm just to say that I do hope that it is something that you.
Yeah, no, I'm actually. I mean, right now, when I finish this conversation, I've got to get back to an essay I'm writing, which is about taking forward some of the work that I've done already. So I'm looking at some of his activism, like his pro-Palestinian activism. I've spoken to some more people in the party who are based here in the US. So I fully intend to to take forward like some of this work and to do more, because, you know, I mean that text it's just a small little thing, really, you know. And I knew it was hard work.
You were dipping your toe in.
I was dipping my toe in, right? I was dipping my toe, yeah. But, you know, and I think, but that's also reflective of what I could get my hands on, right? I would need to spend more time, like in Guinea and the archive and all that. Like I literally had to, like, you know, it's like one of those things. You have like a few documents. You're like, okay, like what can I get from this? Like, you know, you're just like struggling.
If they haven't been to, because I've been there to the archive, to the house.
Oh, amazing. Okay.
And the other thing about, you know, even just in terms of the preservation, right? Like this is very much like the way that it's being preserved is very much just like a love project. Like it's not anything that a bunch of money has been thrown at. And so right. Even in terms of the climate conditions, where the papers are, like, you know, whether or not they're organized to a certain degree, like all of these things are things that need to be done. And that for the most part, unless somebody is just really making it their life's work, it's nothing you don't really have the resources to do unless you have the benefit of academia in a lot of ways.
Oh, yeah, right, exactly. And again, you know, that gives me a bit of, you know, I can maneuver and a bit of cover as well to do that sort of work, right? So yeah, but I mean, like just to go back to the question, I don't think academia is a be all and end all of everything, like, and I think that's like, and I think that's important. Like, I think because I've lived. I was a journalist before I came into here. Like, I think all of these different mediums, I mean, they're mediums basically, right? They are mediums. of kind of doing the work, right? Journalism has its role. So does academia, and then even journalists, academia, they're not actually the work. Like, they're the intellectual work, but the struggle goes on, right? And yes, you're informing and whatever and drawing from, but for me, it's like academia is another string to the bow that I can maybe learn or whatever that can that can make a contribution, basically. I think one of the things of being in my department, so I'm in the Department of Literatures and English at Cornell, and I think one of the things we think a lot about is like form, like what is what is sort of knowledge production. We did for like one of the assignments this semester, we did like a podcast, right? For example, right? Next semester, we've got like Fred Moten's coming next semester, and he's doing a class on like poetry. And like our assignment is to write poetry, like that. We have to write like a small book of poems, right? Do you know what I mean? So like, that's always something on my mind. Like what does knowledge production really look like? And I don't think, because I'm in academia, that question has been answered as yet. And I don't think it needs to be answered. In fact, I think we can express ourselves. Yeah.
I think something that's really important is to think about in the context of the academy, is to think about epistemology. And that is, and you're doing this work on Ture, you mentioned there are many other biographies. These things, like these are epistemological struggles, right? How do we come to know what we know? How do we come to justify value and belief? And so that's very important, I think. And academia is a place where that really comes to the fore. But touch grass. Because one thing about academia, like you did not ask for this advice. I hate unsolicited advice, but it's also like you got to keep one foot out of this thing, because particular debates seem extremely important in academia. But then you look up and you're like, this shit doesn't even matter actually. So it's kind of like, and so touch grass from time to time. You got to climb out the ebony tower. And luckily you have a life before academia, because I went straight through from undergraduate through PhD, never took a break, had a few jobs here and there, but like that has been especially important for me. But you've had a life outside of academia. You understand that the world, it's a bigger world out there, Peter Pan, but like that's very, very important. Especially when the other people who felt like they have propriety over a subject want to sort of claw their way in. So it's, it's a thing.
That and keeping exactly what you said about your own politics, because academia will try to push you away from that shit. And I know for me, it was, for me, I made a decision to do my PhD close to home because, and I made a decision. So my mother was there at the founding of the AAWRU, and so I even write about that in my own dissertation. So like, even in thinking about the things that you're connected to as you do the work, like just don't, the thing that used to piss me off, they would say over and over and over again, you'll get to a point in the program where you can no longer talk to your family or your people about the work that you're doing. That's bullshit. And if you get to that point, you need to figure out what you're doing wrong. if you literally can't talk to them about it. Like, that's not to say that like there aren't concepts that might be new, that might be introduced, but if you can't have those conversations with people, then you don't actually understand things the way you think you do.
Yeah, for real.
Well, I push back on this a little bit, only because it's like sometimes it depends on what your goals are, right? And I think that for you and for us, that's particularly important, but that's not everybody's goal in becoming an academic, nor should it be. Like, everybody's not trying to explain everything to a fifth grader. Everybody's not trying to, and I'm not saying that people who don't have PhDs are, well, because, and I say fifth grader because my mom once told me, if you can't explain it to a fifth grader, you're not doing it right. And my, snide remark was like, I'm not getting a PhD to teach fifth graders. But I think that, to her point, is like, you have to be able to explain things simply. And I think that that's the work for some people. That's not the work for everybody. Everybody's work is not always to translate back. Some people's work is to have a particular type of specialized knowledge and to use that to build other things. But I will say, for the type, it seems to me, the type of work you're trying to do, that ability to speak to, And I think I think we need both. And again, that's the product of my own sort of
But I don't
organization,
think,
academia, I'm sure.
But if you're engaging in political work, you do have to be able to do that.
Sure, if you're engaging in political work, absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. But that's not the totality of the work in academia, nor should it be. So yeah.
I've been really grateful because I mean the you know, like this semester we did a class. You spoke about epistemology, so Professor Carboy Davis, she gave a seminar on Sylvia Wynter, just purely on Sylvia Wynter's work, which is like an amazing sort of introduction into the academy, and has me thinking about all sorts of things. Like, yeah, so there was one we did a class on Black Power as well, and then another one on settler colonialism, actually indigenous feminism with Professor Jodie Bird. So again, like some good foundations to, like, you know, sort of like kind of move from. Yes, it's not easy. It's not easy. But you know, I'm up for the challenge. Yeah.
Well, I think that's a high note to end on.
Absolutely.
And we wish you well, success, and obviously in the program, and hope to hear more from you, more writings, more on Toure, you know, especially. So thank you so much.
Thank you for being here. Yes.
Thank you.
All right, y'all. So I am coming back with a segment from season 1, which I think was a crowd favorite. It is Top 5 Dead or Alive. And again, this is the segment where myself, Layla, 2Black, or a combination of us will list our top 5, or at least the top 5 that come to mind of a given subject, topic, issue, theme, or happening. And so I am going to talk about my top 5 of my manuscript that is officially drafted, Black Scare, Red Scare. Because as we know, you know, writing can be trash. It can be hard. It can be anxiety inducing, but always we need to focus on the things that bring us joy, or our wins or accomplishments when it comes to writing. And so I'm just going to run the top 5 of drafting Black Scare, Red Scare over this long period of time. I don't even know how long it's been, y'all. Like, I feel like I have always been writing this book. I'm always thinking about it. I'm always sort of jotting down notes or whatever about it. And so I just want to share some of the top 5 about Black Scare, Red Scare with you. All right. So number 5 is the writing accountability partnerships and groups that I have used to get this thing done. And so there's been pairs, there's been larger groups, there's been smaller groups, there's been writing challenges I've used. But I will say that accountability has been key, because there have been several times where I'm like, I ain't doing shit today, but then I'll hit up somebody, or they'll hit me up like, hey, we writing, and it's like, all right, let's go. And so that accountability has been so important. And part of those writing groups or writing collectives or writing pairs has been also talking through some of the sort of key things that I'm thinking about, talking through the sticky points, issues that I'm stuck on, and getting feedback from the homies and the comrades. And I really recommend writing groups. Now, most of them have been virtual. There's been a few groups that have been in person. So for example, back in, I want to say August, maybe 5 of us did a writing retreat in Virginia. And that was also really helpful. That really helped me move forward what was then chapter 2, but is now part 2 of the book. So number 5 is my writing accountability collectives, groups, partnerships. Number 4 is the feedback that I have gotten from my developmental editor. And so, yes, I am working with a developmental editor, and these can come in all different styles, sort of partnerships or relationships. And so my developmental editor is really a content editor. I picked him in particular because he has written several books on Black radicalism broadly conceived. He's also working on his own book that's dealing with some of the themes of my particular work. And so it's been interesting getting his feedback. He's gotten more and more sort of enthusiastic and invested in the project, I think, over time. And it's interesting to see the things that he feels are really strong, and those that, you know, in the places where he identifies like holes or concepts that need more development, areas that need more evidence, readings that he recommends. And so it's been really interesting to be able to be in conversation with somebody, because there are just times where I'm like, I don't know what I'm doing with this shit, or like, where should I go with this? And after so what he'll do is he'll read over the chapters, and then he'll do in-text comments, but also write up like a report of that chapter or section or whatever, and then we'll meet via Zoom about it. And so it's been really helpful to get his perspective on a wide range of things, and it just was really, really useful to get somebody who has expertise in my content area. Not all developmental editors are like that, and some will provide different types of feedback. Some help with the development of the project itself. So if you have like some vague idea, but you want to have it concretized, some will work with you in the beginning, some will work with you at the end. I've been working with my developmental editor more or less throughout. I probably started working with him maybe in August or September, I want to say, maybe a little bit later. And so he actually came on a little bit late in the game, but in terms of when I've been like intensively drafting things and turning errant ideas into actual concrete usable chapters, he's been there along the way. So that's been really dope. Highly recommend if you can afford it. And if you're somebody who has a dialogical approach, or you like to bounce ideas off of somebody, I highly recommend a developmental editor. Number 3 is seeing the project change and become more clear over time. Let me just tell you something, okay? Black Scare, Red Scare has looked very, very different over time, down to the name. So initially, the title of my book was The Radical Horizon of Black Betrayal. But I remember when I sent the proposal to my dissertation advisor, he was like, no, that's not the title. And I was like, why not? But ultimately, over time, it was Black Scare, Red Scare, : a whole bunch of things. I'm just dropping the whatever the sort of subtitle is for now, and just calling it Black Scare, Red Scare, which very well may be the title. So anyway, even down to the title, things have developed, but it went from sort of several chapters to 4 main chapters, and now it's actually divided into 3 parts with subsections. And it just makes, given the way that I've approached it in my methodology, it makes the most sense that way. I think it's much more clear. There's more scaffolding because they were too long as chapters. So these chapters were 30,000 words basically or more, which is very, very, very long for a chapter and not very reader friendly. And so seeing the structure change has been interesting. And then just writing my way into stuff, because I'm somebody that I always start with an outline, but I almost never stick to that outline. So outlining is very much part of my process, but it almost never tends to be the guide. And so the idea, so as I'm writing, I'll be like, oh, okay, I need to go this way with developing the ideas, or this is a new section, or I want to sort of, add this in, or this doesn't really make sense, so I'm going to take this out. So for example, in the legitimating architecture part, which is part 2, as I was writing that, I came up with this idea that I wanted to lay out sort of 3 archetypes of radical Blackness that were targeted by the state. And so that wasn't in my initial proposal. It wasn't something that I really came to until I really started going through the documents, and I was like, these particular sort of tropes or types of radical Blackness are being targeted. So let me just go ahead and lay this out. So just developments like that, and just getting more and more clear as I write or as I revise, I think has been really interesting and exciting, because, writing a book is hard as fuck. Like I think I prefer the sort of article model and that length for a, for thinking through an idea or an argument. Sustaining an argument over the arc of a book is really, really, really hard. Especially with Black Scare, Red Scare. So the Du Bois book was a little bit different because you're writing about Du Bois and it's more historical. A theoretical book where I'm trying to offer up a way of understanding broad phenomenon like that, it's just more than a notion. It's very hard. So seeing it being concretized over time has brought me joy and made me feel like, okay, I can do this shit. I would say number 2 is getting back to the primary document. So y'all, I am not a historian, or I don't think of myself so much as a historian, but of course, as a Black studies scholar that is historically nosy. So I've spent a lot of time in various archives. I've taken students to archives, and they have sort of gathered and cataloged and organized archival documents for me as well. I've obviously done my own collection. And so getting back to those archival documents has been really, really dope, because they're, especially somebody like me that is very sort of errant in my approach, you can sort of get all of these documents and hopefully organize them. There's some of them that aren't even fucking organized. They literally are just pictures, and those I have dealt with less because I just can't even want to be bothered. But those that I have organized and labeled and all those things, there still is a way that they can sort of just sit there after that. And so actually returning to the primary documents as opposed to relying on secondary sources, so other people's books or articles, which is important. It's important to be familiar with the secondary literature, but going back to the archival documents and rooting my argument in what and the people's voices who I want to lift up and vivify has been really, 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 I very much enjoyed it. And it's part of my sort of ethical commitment of writing this project of sort of recovering these voices, these thinkers, and also these sites of knowledge production from what I call like intellectual McCarthyism, right? Because we might know a little bit of a biographical information about like a Ben Davis or a William Patterson or a Esther Cooper Jackson, but taking their ideas seriously and taking them as theorists of racial capitalism or of the Black scare and the Red scare, I think is super important. And so I really, liked going back into those documents and offering up. So I don't think that what I'm doing is particularly new or original in the sense that it hasn't been done. I'm just offering up, I think, a novel or a particular way to go about understanding this. But I do think that there are documents that few, maybe Gerald Horn, but few other people have actually engaged with and have taken up in the way that I'm doing it. And so it's also great to contribute to knowledge in that way, because then when people look at the footnotes, they can go to those archives, look at those documents and interpret them in their own way. So that's been dope. And number one is the moments when I realized like I'm actually in my bag and I'm actually making a contribution. And it might be surprising that those moments are not often, right? Because you already feel like somebody, or you might feel like, right, somebody already said this shit, or like, does this even matter? Or, okay, given all that's going on in the world, like does writing this book, like, is this making any type of contribution? But then there are the moments when I like read back over things and I'm like, this is so fucking important. And it actually tells us a lot about what's happening in our current moment and also the development of our current moment. So a history of the present, so to speak, or offering like a genealogy of the present. That has been hands down my favorite part of writing Black Scare, Red Scare, is realizing like, okay, this is actually making a contribution. This is actually in conversation with other texts that I love and I value and that are important. And I think that this will be useful beyond academia. Now, is it something that I think people will necessarily use for political education? I'm not certain, but I do think that some of the concepts can be taken up and discussed and studied, and especially the ways that I engage directly with people who are in struggle, people who are building institutions and organizations and who are combating state repression. I think it's important, and especially in this moment. And so that time when I feel like I'm in my bag is number one. It's the number one thing that I love and enjoy about Black Scare, Red Scare. And not just in terms of some self-aggrandizement, it's more so like, I really think that this will be important to people, and people who are engaging in the types of work that I admire can use this or find this to be relevant to the types of work that they're doing outside of the academy, but also inside the academy. So the guerrilla intellectuals, right? So anyway, that is my top 5, dead or alive, regarding Black Scare, Red Scare. I cannot wait until it comes into the world. I can't wait until I am able to share more and more about it. So that's it.
right, y'all. So before we get out of here for this episode, we wanted to let you know about a few things that are coming up. So we have decided that we will be taking a mid-season break, but there'll be a few things that will happen in between, but we will be coming back officially for part 2 of season 2 on January 21st. But in between, we have some other things. So why don't you tell the people what we got in between, CBS?
All right, y'all. So first of all, we're going to re-air some of our favorite interviews so that in case you missed it, you can catch it again while we are on break. We are going to do at least one live between us, so something that will happen in the interim. That is going to be on 12/29, right? That is going to be 12/29, the week of New Year's. We are going to hop on, myself, Layla, and Two Black, and give our top 21 of 21 political events, happenings in the world, things that happen in our own life. Just what are the 21 remarkable things that happened in 2021? And we might even have some other very special episodes. So still tap in on Friday, still be keyed in, but we are just not going to be recording new interviews until we come back on 121.
All right, y'all. So that's our show. Stay tuned for the very special content in between. We look forward to seeing y'all next year. And that's it. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you were here with us. So thanks for tuning in. I'm Dr. Brown here with my girl, Dr. CBS. And thanks as always to Two Black in the Bag. And we're signing off.
Peace.